Fame has a specific expiration date when you're a child, and nobody tells you what it is. One year you're the most photographed face in America, and the next year the studio stops calling, and you're 16 years old trying to figure out who you are without the only identity anyone gave you. These 20 child stars discovered that the entertainment industry is extraordinarily generous to children and nearly indifferent to what happens to them afterward. Some rebuilt, some vanished, and some are remembered today only because the tragedy of what happened to them became too loud for Hollywood to keep ignoring. Shirley Temple was earning $50,000 per film at age 7, making her one of the most commercially valuable people alive during the Great Depression. That leverage disappeared the moment she hit her teens, and by 22 she had retired from acting entirely. What followed rewrote the story completely. Under the name Shirley Temple Black, she went on to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Ghana and Czechoslovakia, a transformation so complete that younger generations often never realized the diplomat and the child star were the same person. Bobby Driscoll was Disney's first contracted child actor, the voice of Peter Pan, and a Juvenile Academy Award winner at 12. His features changed as he aged. Disney cut him loose at 16, labeled as washed up, and what followed was addiction, crime, and total disappearance from public life. Children playing in an abandoned New York building found a body in 1968 that nobody could identify. A fingerprint match nearly 2 years later confirmed it was Bobby, buried in an unmarked grave at 31, forgotten by the studio that had built entire campaigns around his face. Jay North smiled through 4 seasons of Dennis the Menace, while his aunt and uncle, who managed his career, used punishment as their primary tool. On-set mistakes carried real consequences at home, and the cheerful mischief he performed for cameras bore no resemblance to what he returned to each night. When the show ended at 12, the image trapped him rather than carried him. Meaningful roles never came, and he eventually spent years working as a prison guard. He has only recently spoken openly about a childhood that looked like fame and felt like a cage. Baby Peggy starred in over 150 short films before she turned 6, earning more than $1 million a year during the silent film era of the 1920s. Her father controlled every dollar and clashed with producers until the career collapsed at 7, leaving nothing behind. Vaudeville followed just to survive. As an adult, she reclaimed her identity entirely, becoming Serra Cary, an author who documented child actor exploitation with first-hand authority and lived all the way to 101. Bonita Granville earned an Academy Award nomination at 13 for playing a scheming villain, then built a second reputation as the original Nancy Drew. When those roles dried up, she didn't wait for the industry's permission to move forward. She married producer Jack Rather in 1947, moved behind the camera, and helped build the Lassie television franchise into a cultural institution. Where most of her peers quietly faded, Bonita changed the nature of her influence and stayed powerful on her own terms. Claude Jarman Jr. gave a raw, emotionally devastating performance in The Yearling at 12 and won a Juvenile Academy Award for it. And then, in one of the rarest decisions any child actor has ever made, he simply walked away. He returned home to Tennessee, attended Vanderbilt University, served in the Navy, and eventually became executive director of the San Francisco International Film Festival. Now in his late 80s, he looks back on those Hollywood years without regret. Brandon DeWilde's cry of "Come back, Shane" at 11 became one of the most quoted lines in Western film history and earned him an Academy Award nomination. He managed to keep working into his 20s in films like HUD, but personal instability followed him through those years. On July 6, 1972, he lost control of his car on a tight Colorado turn and died at 30, just weeks before beginning a new film, taken at the exact moment things seemed to be moving forward again. Deanna Durbin's soprano voice saved Universal Studios from bankruptcy before she turned 21, and she became one of the highest-paid women in the United States. Studios kept recycling the same wholesome roles until the gap between what they wanted and who she had become proved impossible to close. At 27, she retired, moved to a village in France, and declined every comeback offer for 6 decades. She died in 2013 at 91, having lived on her own terms from the day she left. Kevin Corcoran was the heart of Disney live-action films like Old Yeller and Swiss Family Robinson, so natural on camera that audiences never thought of him as performing. When those years ended, he studied at Cal State Northridge and returned to the industry as a producer and director, working on Murder, She Wrote and Baywatch without once seeking the attention he'd had as a child. He died in 2015, having quietly made the industry work for him twice. Gloria Jean starred in over 24 musical comedies for Universal during the 1940s and worked alongside Bing Crosby at the height of his career. The transition to adult roles that everyone expected never came. Opportunities vanished almost overnight, and years of working as a hostess and receptionist followed without public complaint. She died in 2018, overlooked by the same system that once positioned her as its next great star. Jackie Coogan was discovered by Charlie Chaplin and cast in The Kid at 6, earning millions during the silent cinema era that his mother and stepfather spent before he could access any of it. The public outrage that followed directly produced the Coogan Law, legislation requiring that a protected portion of a child actor's earnings be held in trust until adulthood. Every performer that law has ever protected owes something to that specific betrayal. Martin Stevens made Village of the Damned genuinely disturbing with a screen presence no adult actor could have manufactured, and the Innocents used his abilities just as effectively. At 16, he stepped away from acting entirely, trained as a teacher, and spent his career in a classroom in England. Fans spent decades wondering what had happened to the boy with the piercing stare. He had simply chosen a quieter life and stayed with that choice. Beverly Washburn worked from the age of 3 before her role in Old Yeller placed her in Disney history. The shift away from Hollywood was gradual rather than dramatic, a slow thinning of opportunities, and she remained warm and open about those years for the rest of her life. She attended fan conventions without bitterness, sharing stories from a golden age of American television and film, which puts her in a smaller group than it should. Johnny Crawford spent 7 seasons on The Rifleman, earned an Emmy nomination at 13, and led a vintage dance orchestra for decades after the television work slowed. In his final years, he battled Alzheimer's disease, and former co-stars rallied around him with the warmth that reflected what he had given audiences across his career. He passed in 2021, remembered not as a casualty, but as someone who never stopped finding reasons to keep performing. Scotty Beckett was one of the original Our Gang cast members before transitioning into roles alongside Judy Garland and Shirley Temple. Addiction and repeated arrests dismantled everything he had built behind the scenes, and the industry eventually stopped offering second chances. In 1968, he was found dead in a Los Angeles motel room at 38. The official cause of death landing somewhere between suicide and overdose, the full truth never established. John Provost played Timmy on Lassie for 7 seasons and found that the identity had permanently closed most of the doors that should have opened afterward. Casting directors saw Timmy regardless of what he auditioned for. He left the industry, settled in Northern California, and built a quiet life attending fan conventions in later years with the equanimity of someone who has made peace with a past he never fully chose for himself. Margaret O'Brien earned a Juvenile Academy Award at 7 for Meet Me in St. Louis and Little Women, performances adult actors spent full careers trying to match. MGM dropped her contract during her teenage years, and when she went to retrieve her Oscar, she discovered it had been stolen, most likely by someone inside the industry. It turned up at a memorabilia auction decades later. She kept working in small roles, but the momentum that once made her a cultural phenomenon never fully came back. Rusty Hamer brought 11 seasons of natural comedic timing to The Danny Thomas Show, and when it ended, Hollywood made no effort to hide that it had no use for him as an adult. He moved to Louisiana, took low-paying work, and in 1990 died by suicide at 42. His death moved fellow former child star Paul Peterson to found a support organization for those the industry had abandoned after they spent their childhoods building it from the inside. Jerry Mathers played the Beaver on Leave It to Beaver, one of American television's most beloved portraits of 1950s family life, and when the series ended, he walked away on purpose. Service in the Air Force Reserve during the Vietnam War followed, then a career in real estate and banking, then years of rumors insisting he had died in combat. He was in California the entire time, living a life entirely removed from celebrity, and by his own account, he was completely fine with it. Butch Patrick played Eddie Munster with a werewolf doll under his arm, and that image became one of the most recognizable in 1960s American television. Hollywood's inability to cast him as anything else followed him through decades marked by addiction and legal trouble, and the fan convention circuit eventually became the most stable ground he could find. He never disappeared entirely, but what came after Eddie Munster bore almost no resemblance to the charm of what came before. These 20 lives tell a story the entertainment industry has never been comfortable telling about itself. A business built substantially on the labor and likeness of children has a long record of walking away the moment those children stop being useful, leaving them to manage fame's aftermath with no support and no preparation. Some found their way through. The ones who didn't left behind something more lasting than any film or television role could have. Every child actor protection law, every support organization, every conversation about the treatment of young performers traces back to names on this list. The marquee forgot them. The consequences never did.